The separation of church and state is something that I just wanted to have a little chat about, really, because it's something that I feel is often misunderstood. The idea with the separation of church and state is not so much the separation of the institutions of church and state, so the institution of church and the institution of state, although that helps. But the spirit of the separation of church and state is actually built into most religions by default. And what I mean by that is that if what you are ultimately answerable to is God or Jesus or whatever it may be, then who you're not ultimately answerable to is the head of state. If you're answerable to Jesus, you're not answerable to Hitler. This is why places like communist Soviet Russia and China to a large extent and North Korea massively do not like religion at all. They don't like, you can't have a Bible in North Korea. Religion is the opiates of the masses, as they put it. They despise religion, and that's because they understand this point, that if Jesus is Lord, then Stalin isn't. And furthermore, it seems to me that when people were trialed, when the Nazis were trialed, for example, at Nuremberg, they weren't being tried by their own German law because they acted lawfully, by their own laws. They were following their policies. And they weren't being judged by just, sort of American or British law or Russian law or anything. They seem to be getting judged against something that you might call kind of the bare bones, minimalistic human morality. And so, this is where what was in mythology has kind of moved into more explicit terms, but it's not really yet fully articulated, which is to say there is a moral principle that everybody should observe, and the state should serve that principle. And when the state becomes so corrupt that it is now completely at odds with the principle, which is what happened, for example, in the Holocaust, then your local laws no longer apply, however they're made, and you're directly answerable to the principle. And it's a complicated point. We called it crimes against humanity, and in an earlier time we might have called it crimes against God. It's the same thing, but stripped of the metaphysics and so on. And I'm not saying that there isn't a metaphysical reality in religion, but nobody knows. But we do seem to act in the world as if there is some kind of principle, and that your ultimate loyalty is to that principle, and that your loyalty to your state only goes so far as that the state is loyal to the principle. And that seems to be what our ancestors were getting at with the typical hierarchical structure of God and then king and then nobility and so on, that everyone's answerable to the people above, but that the whole chain of command is answerable to the principle. And so, it's not necessarily the case that you need to have the separation of the institution of church and state as such. It's just it just helps, because if you've got this thing where there's someone who's claiming that they can interpret the principle, then that's kind of that is a door to corruption, let's say, and so we avoid that as best we can. And one of the ways to avoid it is to separate that, so that the person interpreting the principle has no legal power, and the people who have legal power have no place interpreting the principle. It's helpful, but the point isn't the separation of the institutions. The point is the separation of your ultimate loyalty, to say, I will be loyal and God save the Queen, but only insofar as the hierarchy that's underneath her is serving the principle. that's a really interesting and subtle point that I think a lot of people miss. And ironically, the people who definitely do not miss this point is the people who are most against it. The communist states, China, Russia in the past. China today is iffy with religion, to say the least. Russia's having something of almost like a Christian revival, but it's terribly slow and hard to really get your finger on the pulse of what's going on. North Korea is like you should not own a Bible. North Korea is a really good example of the extremes of non-separation, even though they're technically atheists, because the answer to your problems in North Korea is not a ambition or a morality or any kind of abstract ideal at all. It is the state. It is the dear leader. And so even if you just think purely on a psychological level, that which you value most is your God. In North Korea, the thing that you value most is the state. And so no Bible is allowed, because if Jesus is Lord, Kim Jong-un isn't. To make that statement that Jesus is Lord is a direct statement against tyranny. Basically, it's a direct statement against the totalitarian state, because what it's really saying is that no earthly being is ultimately in charge of me. Because what's in charge of me, if you strip it, if you take the humanist approach and you say, well, there's no metaphysics and there's no objective God and all the rest of it, then what you're really left with is an artistic representation of some values. May he who is without sin cast the first stone and all the rest of it. You're left with a representation of values, and those values are what are ultimately in charge.